Today, we're going to explore one of the oldest childhood fears with 7 terrifying stories involving the Boogeyman. So settle in, make sure there's nothing lurking in the shadows of your room, and let's begin this chilling journey. Oh, and before the Boogeyman comes to get you, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, activate the little bell, and leave your like. This helps the channel a lot and ensures that you don't miss out on any terrifying content like this. Let's go. 1. The hall closet. In the small town of Dunwich, in the English countryside, the Thornton family found what seemed to be the perfect home. A 3-story Victorian mansion with large gardens and a surprisingly affordable price. Michael, a university lecturer, his wife Eleanor, a children's book illustrator, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Oliver, were delighted with the property, which cost less than half its market value. "It's a real find," commented the estate agent Mr. Blackwood, as he guided them through the final tour before they signed the papers. "The house has belonged to the same family for generations, but the last owners, well, they didn't have any children to inherit it." As they walked down the long corridor to the 2nd floor, Eleanor noticed something strange, a cupboard built into the wall, with elaborate carvings of mythological creatures and symbols that looked like ancient runes. Unlike the other cupboards in the house, this one had no handle, just an ornate lock. "What about this door?" asked Eleanor, intrigued by the details of the carving. Mr. Blackwood hesitated for a moment. "Ah, that cupboard. It's been locked for decades. Probably just old storage. The key was never found, but there are so many other spaces in the house that you'll hardly miss this one." In the first few weeks after moving in, the family adapted well to their new home. Michael organized his office, Eleanor set up her illustration studio in the sunny attic, and the children explored every corner of the property with typical childhood enthusiasm. It was Oliver who first mentioned hearing something. "There's someone breathing inside the wall," he said over dinner, about a month after the move. "It's probably just the wind in the old pipes," explained Michael, exchanging a reassuring glance with Eleanor. But the next night, Emma heard it too. "It's not the wind, Dad," she insisted. "It sounds like someone whispering my name." Eleanor began to notice other disturbing details. Sometimes, as she passed through the hallway at night, she had the impression that the wood of the locked cupboard vibrated slightly. On other occasions, she swore she could smell a strange odor emanating from the crevices, something ancient and organic, like damp earth mixed with a metallic tang, reminiscent of blood. The children began to avoid the corridor, preferring to go around the back staircase to get to their rooms. Oliver developed recurring nightmares about the skinny man in the closet who eats children, and Emma started sleeping with all the lights on. Worried, Eleanor researched the history of the house in the local library. What she discovered deeply disturbed her. Thornhill Manor, its original name, had been the scene of mysterious disappearances over the centuries. Every generation, children went missing, usually from the family that owned it, but occasionally visitors or young servants. The last case had occurred in 1963, when the owner's twin sons disappeared without a trace. Most disturbing was a reference in an old newspaper to a guardian that the family kept to protect the outside world. The article vaguely mentioned a cupboard sealed with ancient protections. That evening, Eleanor shared her findings with Michael. "I think there's something in that cupboard," she concluded. "Something that was deliberately locked away." Michael, ever the skeptic, suggested that they investigate the cupboard to put an end to the family's fears. With a crowbar and determination, he tried to force the door the next morning, but the old wood held like steel. It was Emma who found the key, hidden inside a children's book in the library. An old volume of English folk tales, opened exactly to the story of the Bagman, a local version of the Boogeyman. The key was small and made of a dark metal that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. "We shouldn't use it," warned Emma, surprisingly serious. "He's hungry." Ignoring his daughter's warning, Michael took the key. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, he and Eleanor stopped in front of the mysterious cupboard. The lock seemed to pulse slightly as Michael brought the key closer. "Maybe we should wait," Eleanor suggested, suddenly apprehensive. "Do more research on the house, talk to local historians, and continue to leave the children terrified because of an empty cupboard," replied Michael. "Let's get it over with." The key turned with surprising ease, as if the lock was eager to be opened. A soft click echoed down the corridor, and the closet door opened a few centimeters, releasing a scent of damp earth and something older and deeper, the smell of primordial fear. Michael pulled the door fully open, expecting to find dusty shelves or perhaps a small storage space. Instead, he saw only darkness, a darkness that seemed deeper than the absence of light, as if it were a tangible substance that filled the space. "There's nothing here," he said, leaning in for a closer look. "Just empty space." It was then that the darkness moved, not like shadows displaced by light, but like something alive and conscious. Two bright spots appeared at Michael's eye level, not reflecting light, but emitting a sickly yellow glow. Eleanor instinctively pulled Michael back, but it was too late. A hand, long, thin, with fingers that looked like twisted twigs, emerged from the darkness and grabbed the air where Michael had been a second before. "Close the door," shouted Eleanor, but the door now resisted, as if something were holding it from the other side. A whisper escaped from the closet, not in English, but in an older language that they still understood perfectly. "Free at last. So hungry. Children so close." With a joint effort, Michael and Eleanor managed to push the door closed again. Michael turned the key in the lock, hearing the comforting click of the mechanism. "What was that?" he gasped, his hands shaking. Before Eleanor could answer, a childish scream echoed from Oliver's room. Running desperately down the corridor, they found the room empty, the window closed, no sign of a struggle, just the messy bed and Oliver's favorite teddy bear lying on the floor. In the next room, Emma was sitting on the bed, pale but calm. "I warned you," she said in a strangely adult voice. "He always takes the youngest first. It's always been like that in the Thornhill family." The last shift. In the small town of Edinburgh, Scotland, young Eliza Morgan took a job as a night nanny for the Blackwood family. Desperately in need of money for her university fees, she didn't think twice when she saw the amount on offer. 3 times more than normal, for just looking after an 8-year-old boy for a few nights. The Blackwood mansion was isolated on the outskirts of the city, an imposing Victorian structure surrounded by a shabby garden. When Eliza arrived for her first shift, she was greeted by Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, an elegant but strangely distant couple. "Thomas has a bit of trouble sleeping," explained Mrs. Blackwood, avoiding eye contact. "He has a very vivid imagination. He insists there's something under his bed." "Children and their night fears," commented Eliza with an understanding smile. "Don't worry, I know how to deal with it." Mr. Blackwood handed her a list of instructions. "Follow these rules to the letter. Never leave Thomas alone after dark. Don't look under his bed, no matter what he says, and most importantly, don't sleep during your shift." When the Blackwoods left, Eliza met Thomas, a pale boy with big, frightened eyes. While they played with his toys, he seemed normal. But when the clock struck 8, his behavior changed dramatically. "It's almost time for him to wake up," whispered Thomas, glancing nervously at his bed. "Who, dear?" asked Eliza. "The Boogeyman. He lives under my bed. Mom and Dad don't believe me, but he's there. He takes the nannies away." Eliza smiled, thinking it was just a child's imagination. "Well, I'm here to protect you. No bogeymen will bother us tonight." When bedtime came, Thomas refused to lie down. "Please don't make me sleep here. Can we stay in the living room?" "Your parents were clear about you sleeping in your own bed," replied Eliza, gently but firmly. Reluctantly, Thomas lay down, clutching the covers. "Don't sleep," he warned, "and never, ever look under the bed." After Thomas finally fell asleep, Eliza sat down in the chair by the window. To pass the time, she began to explore the room quietly. On a shelf, she found an old photo album. Leafing through it, she noticed something disturbing. Photographs of different children in the same room, all with different dates, some going back decades. Even stranger was a second album, hidden behind children's books. This one contained photographs of young women, all with the same frightened expression. On the last page, a list of names with dates, the most recent just 3 months ago. With a shudder, Eliza realized that they were the names of nannies. A sudden noise under Thomas's bed broke the silence. A scratching sound, like nails against wood. Thomas remained asleep, but his face contorted into an expression of fear. Eliza's instincts told her to check under the bed, but the words of Thomas and Mr. Blackwood echoed in her mind. Instead, she went to the hallway, where she found a locked door. Using a hairpin, she managed to open it, revealing a small office. On the desk, she found old diaries. The most recent one, belonging to Mr. Blackwood, contained a disturbing entry. "Another nanny has disappeared. We need to find a replacement quickly. The creature is getting impatient. As long as we keep providing sacrifices, it will leave Thomas alone. This pact has protected our family for generations." Horrified, Eliza realized the truth. She wasn't there to protect Thomas. She was there as a sacrifice for something that lived under his bed. At that moment, she heard a muffled scream coming from Thomas's room. Running back, she found the boy sitting up in bed, pointing at the floor. "He's awake now," whispered Thomas, "and he knows you found out." Eliza felt something grab her ankle, long cold fingers pulling her down. Struggling desperately, she managed to free herself and pulled Thomas off the bed. "We have to get out of here," she gasped, dragging the boy into the hallway. "We can't," replied Thomas with frightening calm. "No one can escape the bogeyman. Mum and Dad will come back in the morning and find another name to add to the album." As they ran down the stairs, Eliza noticed that the lights in the main entrance had come on. The Blackwoods were coming back. It was no coincidence. They knew what was going on. With Thomas in her arms, Eliza ran to the back of the house. As they ran off into the night, the boy looked back one last time. "He'll find us," said Thomas with grim certainty. "He always does. And now he has 2 of us to hunt." 3. The Lullaby. In the city of Edinburgh, Scotland, young widow Catherine Mackenzie was struggling to raise her 4-year-old son William, alone after her husband's sudden death in a car accident. Recently moved into her maternal grandmother's old house, Catherine was trying to rebuild their lives while dealing with the grief and sleepless nights caused by William's constant nightmares. "There's a monster in my closet, Mum," William insisted every night, refusing to sleep alone. "He has long fingers and eyes that glow in the dark. Catherine attributed her son's fears to the trauma of losing his father, but the deep circles under the boy's eyes worried her more and more. After weeks of interrupted nights, she decided to explore the attic of the house, in search of some comforting object from childhood that could help William feel safe. Among dusty boxes, Catherine found an old leather-bound book with her family crest. It was a diary that had belonged to her great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Mackenzie, containing recipes, home remedies, and family traditions. On the last page, written in delicate handwriting, was a lullaby entitled "Protection Against the Night Spreader." "Sleep well, dear child. Close your eyes without fear, for this song will protect you from what lurks in the darkness." The rest of the lyrics described how the song would keep away the creatures that lurked in the shadows of children's bedrooms. Catherine smiled, thinking she had found the perfect solution to William's fears. That night, after her bath and the usual story, Catherine sat on the edge of her son's bed and began to softly sing the old lullaby. The melody came naturally to her, as if engraved in her genetic memory. William fell asleep almost instantly, a faint smile on his lips for the first time in months. Catherine felt immense relief to see her son finally resting. She kissed his forehead and quietly left the room, leaving the door ajar as usual. Exhausted, she quickly fell asleep in her own room. At around 3 in the morning, Catherine woke up startled, not knowing exactly what had woken her. An abnormal silence hung over the house. Not even the ticking of the antique clock in the living room was audible. Then she heard it, a melodic whisper coming from William's room, as if someone was singing very softly. Thinking that perhaps her son had woken up, Catherine got up and walked down the corridor. As she approached William's room, she realized that it wasn't the boy's voice she was hearing. It was a deeper, harsher voice, singing the same lullaby she had sung hours before, but with a distorted cadence that made each word sound like a threat. Pushing the door open slowly, Catherine saw William still asleep, but he wasn't alone. A tall, thin figure was leaning over the bed, his back bent at an impossible angle. Long, thin fingers, more like twisted twigs, stroked the boy's hair while the creature continued to sing in a voice that seemed to come from a deep, dark well. Catherine froze, unable to scream or move. The creature slowly turned its head, a face with no defined features except for 2 eyes that glowed like dying embers. It smiled, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "Mother sings to call, son sleeps to wait," whispered the creature in a voice that sounded like dry leaves blown by the wind. "Ancient song, ancient pact. You called, I came." With horror, Catherine realized her mistake. Returning to the attic in a panic, she reread the diary more carefully. In the margins of the page, in letters almost obliterated by time, there was a warning. The song doesn't drive the stalker away. It invites him in. Sung by generations to offer the child in exchange for family prosperity. May God forgive me for keeping this tradition. Catherine then understood why her family had always prospered despite adversity. For generations, mothers had inadvertently offered their children to the night stalker, the Boogeyman, through song, believing they were protecting them. Desperate, Catherine ran back to William's room, but the door was now locked. On the other side, she could hear the creature still singing, its voice now mixed with William's childish laughter. "He's mine now," said the voice through the door, as was his uncle before him and his great-grandfather before that. The song has been sung, the pact has been sealed. Catherine pounded on the door, with all her might, screaming her son's name. When she finally managed to break in, she found the room empty. The window was open, the curtains swaying gently in the night breeze. On William's messy bed, there was only a piece of paper in shaky, childish handwriting. "Don't cry, Mummy. The Shadow Man says I'll be fine. He'll take me where all the other Mackenzies have gone. He says you can bring me back if you find another child to take my place. That's how the pact works." Over the next few months, Catherine obsessively scoured family records, discovering a sinister pattern of sick or missing children every generation, always followed by periods of unexplained prosperity for the family. She also discovered that some children had returned years later when another child was offered in their place. Now, Catherine spends her evenings in the rocking chair in William's empty room, humming the old lullaby as she watches the neighboring houses, where other mothers rock their children to sleep, completely oblivious to the horror that a simple melody can invoke. And sometimes, when the moon is high, she swears she hears William's laughter echoing in the shadows. What's up, guys? The Boogeyman stories are chilling so far, aren't they? If you're enjoying these spooky tales, how about taking a quick break and subscribing to the channel? Just click on the subscribe button below and leave a like too. It really helps the channel grow and motivates me to keep bringing you more terrifying content like this. Now let's get back to our Boogeyman stories, shall we? There's still a lot of terror ahead. 4. The Children's Therapist. In the city of Edinburgh, Scotland, Dr. Malcolm Reed had built up a solid reputation as a children's therapist specializing in phobias. His welcoming office was a haven where traumatized children found comfort and eventually healing. Everything began to change when Lily Adams, a 7-year-old girl, was brought in by her worried parents. Lily had stopped sleeping in her own room, insisting that the thin man watched her from the dark corner every night. "He's very tall," Lily explained, drawing an elongated figure with disproportionately long arms and tapered fingers. "His eyes are like holes, and he smiles without a mouth." Malcolm nodded understandingly. Shadowy figures were common manifestations of childhood anxiety. Through therapy, he was confident he could help Lily. A week later, the parents of Oliver Bennett, a 6-year-old boy who lived on the other side of town and didn't know Lily, approached Malcolm with an identical concern. Oliver described the same figure, the Shadow Man who hid in his closet. Oliver's drawing was disturbingly similar to Lily's, the same skeletal figure, the same empty eyes, the same fingers elongated like twigs. Over the next few weeks, 5 more children were brought to Malcolm's office, all describing the same entity in consistent detail, despite living in different neighborhoods and attending different schools. Coincidence was statistically impossible. Malcolm began researching local folklore, discovering references to an old Scottish legend about Amphir Leath Moor, the Grey Man, an entity that fed on children's fears. "Just a folk tale," Malcolm muttered to himself, although a shiver ran down his spine. Determined to find a rational explanation, Malcolm began visiting the children's homes, looking for environmental patterns, some common TV program, a school textbook, anything that could explain the consistency of the reports. It was while visiting the Adams house that Malcolm noticed something disturbing. While talking to Lily's parents in the living room, he saw out of the corner of his eye a tall, thin figure in the dark hallway. When he turned his head, there was nothing there. That night, in his apartment, Malcolm woke up at 3:17 a.m. with the feeling that he was being watched. In the darkness of the bedroom, The corners seemed darker, deeper than usual. Turning on the lamp, he swore he saw something retreating into the shadows. Over the next few days, Malcolm began to notice disturbing patterns. Objects in his office subtly shifted. The lights flickered when he was alone. And most disturbing, in his notes about patients, words he didn't remember writing appeared in the margins. Always the same phrase. "Now you see me too." During a session with Oliver, the boy looked into the corner of the room and froze. "He's here," he whispered, pointing. "And he's looking at you, Doctor." "Reed? Not me." Malcolm felt a chill at the back of his neck, but kept his professional composure. "There's nothing there, Oliver." Oliver shook his head slowly. "He says you're lying. He says that now you know about him. You're going to visit him too." That night, Malcolm consulted an old psychology professor, Dr. Campbell, a specialist in folklore. "There are things between heaven and earth that we don't fully understand," said the old man. "Some entities feed off the attention they receive. The more you think about them, the more power they have over you." "Are you suggesting that this thing is real?" asked Malcolm, incredulous. "I'm suggesting that the line between the imaginary and the real is thinner than our science likes to admit," replied Campbell. Returning to his apartment, Malcolm found all the lights off, although he was sure he had left them on. In the dark, his living room seemed larger, the corners deeper, the shadows denser. A whisper came from somewhere nearby. "Doctor who cures fears must have his own fears cured." Malcolm frantically turned on the lights. There was no one there, but on the wall, something that looked like black paint ran down, forming words. "The more you study me, the stronger I get." Her phone rang. It was Lily's mother. "Doctor, Reed, something strange has happened," she said, her voice shaking. Lily woke up this morning saying that the thin man isn't going to bother her anymore. She said he found someone more interesting to visit. One by one, the families of her patients called, reporting the same thing. The children were no longer afraid. They all mentioned that the man in the shadows had found a new friend. That night, exhausted after days without proper sleep, Malcolm finally succumbed to fatigue. In his dream, he found himself in a dark, endless corridor. In the background, a tall, thin figure watched him, its arms too long for a human body. "Why me?" asked Malcolm in his dream. "Why not carry on with the children?" The figure tilted its head at an impossible angle. "Children overcome their fears," it replied in a voice that sounded like dry leaves. "Adults feed them, and you, Doctor, have fed me so well with your curiosity." The next morning, when Malcolm didn't show up for his sessions, his assistant went to check the apartment. He found it empty, with a single sheet of paper on the table. A child's drawing of a tall, thin figure holding the hand of a man who looked a lot like Dr. Reed. 5. The family heirloom. In the small town of Ravenswood, in the north of England, Victoria Blackwood returned to the family mansion after a 20-year absence. The death of her grandmother, Eleanor Blackwood, the last matriarch of the family, brought her back to the place she had sworn never to set foot in again. Blackwood Manor, an imposing Victorian structure, had been the center of town for generations. The family had always prospered, even during the worst economic crises. This Blackwood luck was a source of admiration and envy among the locals. Victoria arrived with her 7-year-old son Nathan, a quiet and introspective boy. She had only planned to settle the estate and leave, but Eleanor's will contained a disturbing clause. Victoria would only receive her inheritance if she stayed at the manor for at least a month. just long enough to learn the family traditions, the document said. The first night, while unpacking in her old childhood bedroom, Victoria found a book bound in dark leather, hidden behind a loose panel. It was the diary of her great-grandmother, Constance Blackwood, dated 1897. The first few pages described hard times, lost crops, illnesses, bankruptcies. Then, an entry changed everything. "We made the pact today. The Shadow Lord has accepted our offer. Little Mary Collins from the village will be missed by many. They said she was troublesome. In return, he promised prosperity for the Blackwoods for generations to come. All we have to do is feed him every 7 years with a difficult child. May God forgive us." Victoria felt nauseous as she realized the truth. Her family's fortune had been built on a dark pact. For generations, problem children from the region had mysteriously disappeared, always coinciding with new periods of prosperity for the Blackwoods. The next morning, the family lawyer, Mr. Winters, visited the mansion. His gaze lingered on Nathan in a way that made Victoria shudder. "Your son seems special," Winters commented. "Eleanor mentioned that he has certain difficulties." Victoria instinctively protected Nathan. The boy had been diagnosed with mild autism, which made socializing difficult. At his previous school, teachers had labeled him problematic for his sometimes defiant behavior. "He's fine," she replied dryly. "He just needs understanding." Winters smiled coldly. "Of course. By the way, the Harvest Festival is coming up, an important tradition for the family." After his departure, Victoria continued exploring the mansion. In the basement, she found a locked door. Using the old key she had found with the diary, she opened it, revealing a small room with walls covered in photographs of children, dozens of them, from different eras. Below each photo, a date and the word offering. With growing horror, Victoria recognized the pattern. Every 7 years, a new child. The last photo was from 2016. It was time for a new offering. That night, Victoria heard Nathan talking in his room. When she entered, he was alone, staring into the dark corner. "Who are you talking to, dear?" she asked. "The man in the shadow," Nathan replied quietly. "He says I'm special, that he's going to take me to a place where I won't be a problem anymore." Victoria's heart froze. She locked all the doors and windows of the mansion, keeping Nathan constantly under her watch. But every night, the shadows in the corners seemed to grow, and objects moved inexplicably. A week later, over dinner, Nathan looked over Victoria's shoulder and smiled. "He's here again," said the boy. "He says it's time for the tradition to continue." Victoria turned sharply, catching a glimpse of a tall, thin figure dissolving into the shadows. Panicked, she picked up Constance's diary again, desperately searching for some way to break the pact. On the last pages, she found a note. "The pact can be broken only with the willing blood of a Blackwood, but the price is high. All the prosperity gained will be reversed." On the night of the Harvest Festival, the oldest residents of Ravenswood gathered at the mansion. Victoria recognized the ritual disguised as celebration. They were there to witness the continuation of the pact. Mr. Winters approached with a sinister smile. "It's time, Victoria. The tradition must continue. Your son or another problem child from the village, the choice is yours." Victoria looked at Nathan, who was playing alone in the corner. She thought of all the children who had disappeared, sacrificed to keep their family rich and healthy. "No," she said firmly. "That ends today." That night, while the guests were asleep, Victoria took Nathan to the basement. In the small room with the photographs, she slit her own wrist, letting the blood drip into the center of the room. "I offer my blood voluntarily," she declared. "The pact is broken." An icy wind swept through the room, and the shadows condensed into a monstrous figure with eyes like bottomless pits. "You reject prosperity," hissed the creature. "The price will be high." "I accept the price," Victoria replied, hugging Nathan protectively. The next morning, news arrived. The shares in the Blackwood Company had plummeted. The fields around the mansion were withering inexplicably, and Victoria woke up with the first symptoms of an illness that doctors could not diagnose. 6. The Night Orphanage. In the isolated hills of northern Scotland, Ravenscroft Orphanage stood, like a Gothic fortress against the grey sky. Built in the 19th century to house abandoned children, the place maintained an ambiguous reputation, officially praised for its exemplary discipline, but shunned by the locals. Sarah Bennett, a recently graduated social worker from Edinburgh, arrived on a rainy October morning for her new job. Idealistic and determined, Sarah had applied for this placement after reading worrying reports about the unusual number of night transfers of children. The director of the orphanage, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, welcomed Sarah with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Although records indicated that she had been running the orphanage for almost 3 decades, Mrs. Blackwood looked no older than 40. Immaculate skin, shiny black hair, and an elegant posture. "Welcome to Ravenscroft, Miss Bennett," she said. "Our children need structure and discipline. I hope your modern theories don't interfere with our proven methods." In the first few days, Sarah noticed disturbing behavior among the children. They spoke only when addressed directly, avoided eye contact, and most strangely, all voluntarily retreated to their rooms at sunset. It was Lily, an 8-year-old girl with frightened eyes, who first mentioned the night visitor during a therapy session. "He comes when the lights go out," whispered Lily, drawing a tall, thin figure. "Mrs. Blackwood says he only takes the disobedient, but that's not true. He takes whoever she chooses." "Who's he, Lily?" asked Sarah gently. "We can't say his name," replied the girl, "but the old children called him the Boogeyman. He feeds on us." Sarah initially attributed the story to childhood fears, but when other children told almost identical versions of the same story, her concern grew. During the 3rd week, a violent storm isolated the orphanage. That night, Sarah heard footsteps in the corridor. Peeking through the door, she saw Mrs. Blackwood leading a sleepy boy, Jamie, a newly arrived orphan, towards the basement. Sarah followed them silently, down the stairs that led to an underground chamber. Hidden in the shadows, she witnessed Mrs. Blackwood, speaking in an ancient language, position Jamie in the center of a circle of symbols. "This year's 12th, as promised," said the principal. "Young, healthy, and full of wasted potential." The shadows began to thicken, forming a figure of impossible proportions. Limbs too long, fingers like twisted twigs, and eyes that absorbed the light. "Is our agreement still satisfactory, Eleanor?" The creature's voice sounded like dry leaves. 70 years of faithful service." "It gets harder every year," replied the principal. "The authorities ask more questions, send inspectors, but I'll do my part." The creature touched Mrs. Blackwood's face. Where its fingers brushed, the skin momentarily wrinkled and then rejuvenated. "Youth for sacrifice," murmured the entity. "A fair price." Sarah stifled a scream, alerting Mrs. Blackwood. "It seems we have an intruder," said the principal. "Perhaps we can offer 2 sacrifices." The next few days turned into a deadly game. Sarah, now aware of the truth, tried to contact the authorities, but the phone lines were cut off by the storm. Sarah discovered hidden records, documents from 1953, when Eleanor took over the orphanage. Photographs showed the same woman, unchanged by time. And most disturbing, lists of transferred children, almost 800 names over 70 years. In the library, Sarah found a book describing entities that fed on human vital essence. One passage mentioned the consumer of youth, a creature that granted longevity in exchange for sacrifices. On the night of the winter solstice, when Mrs. Blackwood was planning a special sacrifice, Sarah confronted the principal in the underground chamber. "I know about your pact," Sarah declared. 70 years ago, you offered children in exchange for youth, but you forgot to read the fine print." Mrs. Blackwood laughed. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "I understand perfectly," replied Sarah. "The consumer can only accept sacrifices offered by a legitimate guardian. But you were never the legal guardian of these children. Every sacrifice was a breach of contract." The shadows condensed, and Sarah continued. "For 70 years, the pact has been corrupted. The contract is broken." The creature that emerged fixed its eyes on Mrs. Blackwood. "Is it true?" it hissed. "You had no right over them?" The principal's face paled, sudden wrinkles appearing. "I run this place. They're my responsibility." "But they're not yours to give away," replied the creature. "The contract has been broken. 70 years of stolen youth must be returned." Mrs. Blackwood's scream echoed as her body aged decades in seconds, skin wrinkling, hair whitening, bones bowing. When the authorities arrived days later, they found the children unharmed, under Sarah's care. All that remained of the former principal was a mummified body that doctors estimated to be over 120 years old. Ravenscroft Orphanage was closed permanently, and in the hills of northern Scotland, locals still tell stories about the moonless nights when a tall figure can be seen wandering the ruins, looking for a contract that will never be fulfilled. 7. The Magic Lantern. In Edinburgh, Scotland, Malcolm Fraser's antique store occupied a narrow building on the Royal Mile. Among pendulum clocks, fogged mirrors, and Victorian furniture, Malcolm cultivated a reputation for finding peculiar items with even more peculiar stories. At 60, with grey hair and shrewd eyes, he knew the value of a good tale as well as good merchandise. One rainy October morning, while cataloguing items from a newly acquired estate, Malcolm came across an ornate brass lantern. It was distinctly Victorian, with elaborate carvings of mythological creatures and symbols that looked like ancient runes. Unlike ordinary lanterns of the time, this one had an internal rotating mechanism and colored crystal lenses. "A magic lantern," he muttered, recognizing the device used to project images onto walls before the invention of cinema. As he wiped away decades of dust, he noticed an inscription on the base: "Lux contra tenebris," light against darkness. Out of curiosity, Malcolm filled the reservoir with oil, lit the wick, and pointed it at the empty wall of the store. When he turned the mechanism, it wasn't fairy tale images that appeared, but patterns of light that formed ancient symbols of protection, the same ones carved into the lantern, now magnified and pulsing gently. Fascinated, Malcolm researched the origin of the object. The diary that accompanied the booty mentioned that the lantern had belonged to a Victorian shadow hunter called Edward Blackwood, who had commissioned it specifically to keep away he who lurks, a reference to the Boogeyman in local folklore. Malcolm considered the lantern a historical curiosity, nothing more, until the Caldwells entered his store. Anne and Robert Caldwell looked exhausted, with deep circles under their eyes and tense expressions. Their 6-year-old daughter, Emily, clung to her mother, wide-eyed and vigilant. "We're looking for something specific," Robert explained quietly. "Something that can protect a children's room." "My daughter hasn't slept for weeks," Anne continued. "She says there's something in her room, something that waits in the shadows." Emily looked directly at Malcolm. "It has long fingers and sharp teeth," she whispered, "and it promises to take me away when everyone's asleep." A shiver ran down Malcolm's spine. The girl's words echoed old descriptions of the Boogeyman, the child collector, the night lurker. "We've tried everything," said Robert. "Doctors, psychologists, even a priest. Someone mentioned that you deal with unusual items." Malcolm hesitated. Normally, he would sell some harmless, magical trinket to desperate parents, a dream catcher, a protective stone. But something in Emily's terrified expression touched him deeply. "I have something that might help," he said, reaching for the flashlight. He explained its supposed history and function, presenting it as a historical curiosity with possibly comforting properties. The Caldwells paid the high price without question. Malcolm demonstrated how to fill the reservoir with oil and light the wick, casually mentioning that it would need to be refilled regularly. "Keep it lit overnight," he instructed. "The images are comforting for children." That night, the Caldwells positioned the lantern in Emily's room. When the lights went out, the projected symbols danced across the walls, creating a hypnotic pattern. For the first time in weeks, Emily slept soundly. Over the next few nights, the transformation was remarkable. Emily smiled again. The nightmares stopped, and the oppressive feeling that hung over the house disappeared. Anne called to thank Malcolm, who felt genuinely proud to have helped. 2 weeks later, Malcolm woke up startled at 3:17 in the morning. A disturbing dream had woken him. In it, he saw the Caldwell's lantern with its fading flame, and something moving in the shadows beyond the circle of light. The next morning, he consulted Edward Blackwood's diary again, reading more carefully. One passage chilled him. "The lantern does not destroy the lurker. It only keeps him at bay. Each night of protection is an accumulated debt. When the light fails, he will come to collect all the children he has been denied, with compound interest of terror." Malcolm tried to contact the Caldwells immediately, but found that they had left for a weekend in the countryside, unreachable by phone. Driving frantically to the Caldwell residence, Malcolm found the house empty. A neighbor mentioned that they had left on Friday for a secluded cottage in the Highlands, a celebration for the return of Emily's peaceful sleep. When he finally located the cottage after hours of searching, the sun was already setting. As he approached, he saw lights flickering erratically in the windows. Inside, she found the lantern on the central table, its flame flickering faintly, the oil almost exhausted. The walls were covered in projected symbols, but now they seemed distorted, forming silhouettes of elongated fingers and 2 wide smiles. In the shadows between the symbols, something was moving, something that shouldn't be there. "The oil!" shouted Malcolm to the terrified Caldwells clustered in the corner of the room. "The lantern's almost out of fuel." As Robert ran to refill the lantern, Malcolm noticed Emily staring into a dark corner, nodding softly as if talking to someone. "He says, 'I've been borrowed,'" whispered the girl. "He says the debt has grown, and now he needs not only me, but all the children in the neighborhood." The flame of the lantern flickered one last time and went out. In the silence that followed, Malcolm heard a sound, like long, thin fingers, gently scratching the walls, coming closer in the dark. And so we come to the end of our 7 horror stories involving the Boogeyman. So, what did you think? Which story gave you the most chills? Let me know in the comments which one was your favorite. If you enjoyed this dive into the terrifying world of the Boogeyman, don't forget to leave your like. It really helps the channel grow and motivates me to keep bringing you more scary content like this. And if you're not subscribed yet, take the opportunity to subscribe now and activate the little bell. See you later.